Welcome to the Blooming League of Original Podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Talk Musicals to Me, a new theatre podcast about musicals and their impact on people. My name is Caroline Sheen and I'm here to quiz some of the leading creatives in the entertainment industry about their relationship with musical theatre and how certain musicals may have influenced their lives in ways you may not even expect. From how they first encountered a musical to musicals they may never even have seen, let's dive in and introduce today's guest to open up and talk musicals to me. Our guest today is the incredible Adam Guettel, Tony Award-winning composer-lyricist of wonderful musicals, The Light in the Piazza, Floyd Collins, Myths and Hymns, and last year, Days of Wine and Roses. I had the absolute pleasure to work with Adam on The Light in the Piazza when it had its European premiere in Leicester Curve back in 2009, I think. And it is an absolute joy and honour to have you here. Hello, Adam.
Hello, my dear. What fun, and thanks for having me.
I'm absolutely thrilled.
I think the first thing we probably should talk about before we get to anything else is Richard III. Remember that parking lot on the way into Leicester,
Yes.
into the curve, which I walked over the exact spot every day from my hotel.
That's hilarious.
You know, gamboling from the hotel over some, sort of divisions in a parking lot that keep you from bumping into other cars. I walked daily on Richard III because years later, maybe 5 or 6 years, they discovered his body there under the parking lot.
In that car park, one of the most notorious monarchs that we've had.
I felt that I had a sense of the sort of apocryphal hunchback when I was walking on that spot. I'm not sure. I'm very sensitive.
Yeah, you were like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah, what's that? Could that be a hunchback king?
Oh, Adam, that was a great time in Leicester working on Light in the Piazza. And you were so generous then coming over. I think you were over with us for like 10 days working on that show.
Yeah, 2 weeks, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, you came over for the Sits probe. You were there for the tech and previews and opening. And it was so wonderful to, it's a real privilege to have the person who wrote the show in the room with you, because often on musicals you're working on revivals, people who aren't around, people are too busy. So to have the person who created it in the room was really special. We could ask you questions, and you could answer it.
I must rejoin with the fact that as a highly controlling person, it's a real privilege to get to be there and control everything. So it's a symbiotic relationship we have there.
Benefits both ways. It's brilliant. I've listened to a few podcasts of yours, and I'm going to direct a few people now who are listening to an incredible YouTube video with you and Stephen Sondheim talking about the craft and the art of writing musicals, because I watched it about 3 times in lockdown. It's such a brilliant interview that you guys have with each other. So a lot of podcasts, obviously, we talk about your career and you talk about the work that you've done. This podcast is a little bit different. I want to talk about the work that you've seen and experienced that has led to the work you've done. So it's a little bit different.
Wonderful. I love it.
Yeah, great.
I'm glad I didn't look at any of the questions beforehand because this is perfect.
The first question I have, I imagine for you it's going to be for everyone it's going to be a unique answer, but for you it's going to be a pretty exciting one for everyone to hear, because your family background was so in the musical theatre canon. Your grandfather was Richard Rodgers of Rodgers and Hammerstein fame. Your mother was a musical theatre creative. She wrote Once Upon a Mattress and many other musicals. So the first question is, what I usually say is, how did you and musical theatre first meet? But I imagine you probably met when you were in your crib, right? So I guess what's your first memory of musical theatre, of going to see something, is what I would ask.
I love to imagine that I was in my crib and my mobile, or I don't know if you call it a mobile, above my head, like Mary Martin and Yul Brynner spinning above my crib.
With shall we dance music going around.
Yes, exactly. Spinning around,
Yeah.
just to get me in there early. The funny thing is, in a general way, there wasn't generally music playing in the house, and even much less so when my mom started writing books, which was, I guess, when I was about 7.
Uh-huh.
But even before that, we didn't have a lot of music playing. And if we did, it would have been probably Sondheim.
Right.
There wasn't a lot of my grandfather's stuff. So in the so-called crib, in the very beginning. But the first show I saw was Oklahoma, and it was a revival at the State Theater when I was 2.
You were 2. That's so young.
I mean, that's about the average age now of theater fans who go back over and over. They're all 2. But I went with my mom, and I kept saying, when's it going to be over? And finally she said, you hate it that much or something? And I was just like, no, I don't want it to be over. I love it so much. I mean, I was maybe 2.5, but we can look it up. But it was Oklahoma, and that just was the most wonderful thing I've ever seen. And adjacent to that is the second best production of Oklahoma I've ever seen was in London with Hugh Jackman under Trevor Nunn, I think. And that was maybe the best, one of the 2 or 3 best performances of anything, I've ever seen. It was absolutely riveting. And at the end of it, I stood up and shouted. And this man, it was long enough ago, this man next to me, this tidy British, perfectly nice gentleman, tugged on my sport jacket and said, we don't do that here. It's like,
no way.
It was so good.
There's lots of articles over here at the minute, do we give our standing ovations away too easily now? Because most things you go and see, you stand up.
Certainly do here. They mean nothing. It's just a stretch. I mean, it means nothing here. They stand up for the worst drivel.
That's awful that somebody's made you sit back down.
Yeah, we don't do that here.
And Oklahoma was groundbreaking, wasn't it? When it was first written,
yes,
it changed the way that musicals were going to be written forevermore, really, with that opening of Curly being off stage singing "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning," as opposed to a chorus line of dancing girls and things like that.
Yeah, there was sort of a lot of rhetorical chances they took, or felt like chances probably at the time, in terms of the tradition of musicals or how you tell stories in musicals at the time. But there were a lot of very deep things that were new about the show also. I mean, Judd, his songs, Lonely Room is just one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And sometimes it even gets cut because people think his character is problematic. Don't get me started with that word. But at any rate, it's a wonderful, adventurous musical for the time and remains riveted together like a battleship. I mean, it just flies along.
I think there's a lot of musical revivals out there that always kind of say, oh, we're taking a new look on something and this isn't a new take. And I feel like saying to quite a lot of people, you're just reinventing the wheel. What you're doing is realizing that the musical is so good that you can see it in so many. It's a little bit like Shakespeare, you can put it in lots of different aspects and it'll still speak to a new generation of people.
I entirely concur. I mean, I just want to say to a lot of those people who insist on putting their imprimatur, their little thumbprint on things, fine, but you could also consider writing your own shit.
Yeah.
Why don't you write your own fucking show?
Yeah.
You're not the author of this just because you besmirched it or vandalized it or graffitied on it or even made it more compatible with mores of today. Presentism is limited in its value in terms of that layer applied to an older piece because the layer of adding present day moral attitudes into older shows is trite, very predictable in our day and age. It happens so much. People think that it's almost their obligation, lest a show be problematic, our favorite word. And 3, very destructive to the actual integrity of a musical in terms of how it's constructed, in terms of anything that is written every piece is written in its own time, whether it be a period piece or a contemporary piece. And it will, in some ways, reflect the mores of that time one way or another. And it should not be dismantled and invaded by incompatible notions to that time and place, to that particular piece, to that musical. I'm not saying these notions aren't correct for us today. I entirely agree with most of them, but to insert them into something that is constructed under a whole other sort of aegis and strategy is very destructive to the integrity of a piece and sometimes makes a real mess of of things.
I think sometimes it can be when people do what you're saying, like you say, they dismiss what's already there. And rather than acknowledging what the original production achieved.
And the sophistication of the original production in its subtleties, or it's not being entirely explicit about certain things that today we feel we must be explicit about, lest someone think that, for instance, Carousel is a story about beating one's wife and thinking it's terrific.
Yeah.
That's not what the story is. It's not what that's about. It was a much deeper thing than that. I've launched right into this thing, but there's a strange phenomenon now where a lot of people who are writing for the theater, even straight plays, feel that they must show people who are doing the right thing. And if they're not, if there's a villain, it must be truly obviously a villain, and why that the people who carry a show must be sort of redeemable in some way. Look, I'm not going to go out to lunch and a beer with like Sweeney Todd, but he's compelling on stage. You know, I mean, there's a lot of great examples.
Definitely don't go into his barbershop, right? Because you'll be in trouble.
Clearly, I don't go very often anyway. But, you know, like, why must we make everyone so sort of, what is this carapace of virtue we must sort of like consign everyone to?
Yeah. And I find that as an actor, it's far more interesting to play somebody who has flaws than somebody who is incredibly virtuous, you know.
Well, having seen you perform, Caroline, you're instantly flawed. You have no problems with
Thank you. I'm glad I achieved that. I loved that you were 2.5 when you went to see Oklahoma, and that you were so enthralled. Do you have a memory of it?
Oh, I do. I remember where we were sitting in the house.
Yeah, that's fabulous.
And I remember shortly after that going to the ballet in the same theater, because it was the New York State Theater, now the Koch Theater, with my father maybe shortly after that, and getting quite bored. I love ballet, but getting quite bored. And he took me out to the first mezzanine above the big lobby, or the second mezzanine. And I remember him talking to me about ballet and looking through the wrought iron thing down to the big lobby and at the State Theater, and just going, now this I don't get. I don't know what that's about, you know, ballet.
There's no words, there's no singing. Come on.
Yeah.
So my next question, which musical were you first personally involved with, you know, on stage or like working on, or where did you first kind of tread the boards?
The very first time I got into the making of a production of a musical was a countryside pavilion on the lake kind of theater with all kids in the cast. And I was asked to do the vocal arrangements, having been a child singer and studying music and starting to write and stuff. So I did that for a show called Too Many Girls, which I think is 1937.
Because you were a boy soprano, right, Adam? That was where you kind of first in operas. So they don't count for this. Although some people do think the Magic Flute was the first musical, don't they? There's an argument for that as well.
That's fair, and perhaps the longest running, if that's what we're going to call it.
Yeah.
And I was in that a lot when I sang professionally. But anyway, that's fair too. You know, in terms of being in the middle of making something, I did lots of work with the Metropolitan Opera and the New York City Opera and Santa Fe Opera, and made recordings. And so I was making a lot of theater as a performer. But in terms of being a creator type adjunct, I was 16. I did the vocal arrangements for Too Many Girls. And then I started writing incidental music for theater pieces at Yale, where I went to college. During my time at Yale, I became the assistant to John Mauceri, a wonderful, brilliant sort of mentor to me over the years. And I was his assistant, you know, unpaid and somewhat unnoticed, which is how it ought to be.
Yeah.
And we worked on Song and Dance, Your Compatriots show, which has some very, very good music in it. And the concept is solid enough. But unfortunately, this production was, I don't know, you know, maybe didn't quite make it to the finish line. But I have a quick story for all of your potential listeners, if they're still listening, which was that I was home and the phone rings. I'm about to go to rehearsal at the Broadway Theater where we're doing Song and Dance. I think we're in tech. And the phone rings, and it's Flora Roberts, my mother's agent, who, if anyone out there remembers her, she sort of talked like this, like a bit, like Bernstein. And she was like, "Hello, madam, is your mother there?" And I was like, "Oh gosh, I'm sorry. Can I take a message?" And so she gives me, and she goes, "So what are you doing right now? What are you up to?" And I said, "Well, I'm assisting John Mauceri on Song and Dance." She goes, "Oh, what do you think of it?" I said, it's a little bit, you know, I'm 20, right? So I have to say this. It's misogynistic. It's a beat and me, and you know, I've got all my opinions and whatever. And she goes, "Okay, well, I'll speak to you soon." So I go to the theater. I get settled into the dark house where they're doing tech, and I get a tap on my shoulder, and I look around, and it's Richard Maltby who's directing it.
All right.
And he goes, "Hey, Adam, I just heard from Flora. You know, she's my agent." And I was like, I mean, even in the dark theater, he probably saw me completely blanch. And he goes, I'm not mad, but I want you to learn this lesson. You cannot say anything to anyone about anything.
That's so true.
Is that clear? And I'm like, got it. But here I am doing, but it's a long time ago, but still like that was a good lesson. He was very kind about it, actually.
It's a great lesson. In this industry, it's a small industry and people talk.
You say one crossword and you're suddenly either on the good team or the bad team.
Yeah.
But why would anyone bring it up again if they didn't want to vilify you?
Yeah. And I think that's the thing with regards to like Richard saying that to you. That was a great thing for you to be aware of.
Great lesson and very kindly put. And he's still a wonderful man. Great guy.
Brilliant. I love that. Song and dance.
Yeah. I did marked parts, did the synth programming.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they came to make the record, there was an upright bass part, I think, for the record that hadn't been part of the live performances somehow. Sometimes things do change for a record. So John Mauceri, the conductor and my sort of mentor, because I played upright bass and I'd been playing for a number of years at that point, 5 years, and playing in clubs and, jazz and whatnot. So he said, do you want to play bass? You'll make a little money and join the union. I was like, yes. So I go to his house, I pick up the book, that you put on the stands, the part. And it's all Arco. It's not Pitts. It's Arco. Ram, ram, ram.
Okay, yeah.
I'd never picked up a bow.
You did?
I had one in the cave, and some of that weird amber stuff you put on the bow, like I guess it's called resin or rosin or whatever.
Yeah.
Like I had to learn how to bow in one night, and I was up until about 4 a.m. I had a German bow, but I was holding it as a French bow because that's what I would see on TV with regular violinists. And I just learned bow in one night, just sweating. And my mom came in around 3 a.m. to the dining room where I was trying to get this right. She goes, it smells like metal in here. That was like barely out of my teens, just expressed.
That's hilarious. So if we get to listen to that'll be your upright bass.
Yeah, check. I'm sure they lowered those notes whenever they come up in the mix.
Well, if anyone could do that, Adam, you could. Absolutely. My next question. Which musical have you seen the most? And obviously not including all the times you've had to watch your own. Which other musicals?
It's a little bit arduous for me to go to shows a lot. If they're bad, obvious reasons not to. If they're good, I do often go more than once, but not many more than once, because for me anyway, it's such intense work to watch another musical that's good because I'm trying to figure out everything that's going on and sort of absorb it. It's exhausting. Like people go to escape. I'm like, I go there to study. And if it's a musical that's really out of my ken, like let's say Serafina, which few people remember, but I think it was done at the Mitzi Newhouse at Lincoln Center like 36 years ago or something like that, a long time ago.
I don't know, Serafina. I will look that up. My producer popped a little note up saying there's a movie version of the story, I guess, with Whoopi Goldberg. So I will look into that.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, right. Well, the musical was glorious and heartfelt and unforgettable. Absolutely marvelous. It's set in South Africa, and it was about the encroaching enormous change there. It was set behind a huge chain link fence. I believe the entire thing was, I don't even know if they decided to use that conceit to have someone escape the fence, but it was the most joyous, gorgeous show, beautifully sung, charismatically, great dance. And I think I saw that about 5 times. I think that was my first time thinking, you must always retool the factory. You must always be prepared to try to tell a story on stage with music that is not your home base, that is not your bailiwick.
Yeah, that's a great word, bailiwick. That is such a good word. I love that word. That's fascinating. The notion of, I absolutely get it now as someone who works in the theatre, but I guess for you, going to the theatre has always been work, or it's been your family's work. So to watch as the fact that you craft them. So it is that thing. Sometimes you want to switch off your head.
It would be nice, but I have other ways of doing that, drugs and stuff. Kidding. But, it was also that my mom, would really quiz me if I saw something. She would want to know for her own reasons anyway, but also make sure I was paying attention. She and I had many conversations about what worked and what didn't. And she was quite intractable in her opinions and sometimes even vocal about them in the theater, especially when she got older. We'd see something bad together when she was in her early 80s and she would go loudly like, "Oh, please." I was like, "Look, I know you have a certain status in this world, Mom, but don't do that. That's embarrassing."
You need to get Richard Maltby round and have a word with her.
Yeah, exactly. Or she'd go, "Come on."
Oh, that's fabulous. I loved your mum. I remember meeting her a couple of times and she was
She came out to Leicester, and
yeah. And she came to the cabaret we did in London as well.
that's right.
I tell my daughter because she's 12 and there was a phase she went through watching Freaky Friday.
Which version?
Both. She liked them both. And then I think was there a musical version as well or something? I might be wrong.
Yes, there has been. With a very good score by Tom Kitt.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's Heidi somebody in it. Is it Heidi
Blockenstock or something?
Yeah, she's fabulous.
Yeah, she's terrific.
So I would, earn parent points by saying that I'd met the lady who wrote the book and the screenplay and everything. So she was quite incredible.
To tag back for a minute to our discussion about presentism, it's a new edition of Freaky Friday. Grâce à Dieu, it's a very popular book still, and it's been published in many languages. And the most recent edition, they want to replace certain language, typical things that we're just not supposed to say today. And I'm not talking about horrifying words, but I'm talking about concepts that were benign in their time and now have taken on a problematic,
Yeah.
and I say no, because if you start to substitute other things, you are removing the very redolence, be it wrong to us today.
Yeah.
Some have tried to ban Huck Finn, but smart librarians don't. We are certainly not condoning something by republishing it. Something I'm not intractable about. I consider it case by case. With my mom's work, which I control her sort of creative estate.
Like the estate, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I'm an official curmudgeon now, I think.
I worked with Lucy Onaz on The Witches of Eastwick. She was a fascinating woman. And I remember her coming in and she was saying she turned down more money than probably all of us would ever see in a lifetime because somebody wanted to make a range of pinball machines with I Love Lucy stuff. And she was like, you're not making a pinball machine with my mum and dad everywhere, their mouths open and balls coming through them and all that. She's like, absolutely not.
See, that I would probably, if they wanted to make a pinball machine with my mom, it would be an apt choice. And I'd say, yeah.
You would love that. I call this my basic question, okay? Which musical made you laugh the most? Which musical made you cry the most?
I'm a pretty cheap date when it comes to laughs, if something's working on its own merits in terms of that. So the first act of Something's Rotten had me going a little bit. When I first saw a revival of Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, I laughed a lot and was very into that show. I don't know, it was about 1970, I think.
Yeah.
And there were women in it who had high boots, like vinyl boots, thigh boots, you call them, I guess.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I remember saying to mom, are they going to come to any of our parties? If they were really
in those costumes.
But that show made me laugh a ton. And often shows that don't even make it, some things, like the first act of a play that Neil Simon wrote called Fools.
Mm-hmm.
I saw it in Boston. I was almost in the aisles. The second act sort of fell apart because the conceit couldn't really sustain itself.
What makes you blub?
I don't really have feelings, so that's a tough one. No, I've cried at La Boheme, certainly.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be sad crying. In the interval of Light in the Piazza, I could not move out of my seat because I was so overwhelmed with emotion and just awe at the theatre that I had just witnessed in front of me. And obviously it's a huge climax at the end of Act 1, but Mike was like, shall we go and get a drink? And I was like, I can't go out there like this. I was literally like shaking, but because it was so great,
it could be that I am usually so attentive to technical things that it's hard for me to let it go there, but I'm aware that I should be, and I don't mean to sound like some sort of, I cry a lot, but I mostly cry, at movies and things. And I sometimes can't leave my seat after movies because I'm not involved and engaged in the way they're made in the same way. And they affect me the way musicals perhaps affect most people who don't make musicals.
It's such a busman's holiday for you. Do you have that phrase in America, a busman's holiday?
I think smart people do. I don't know what that means though, personally. What is that?
So I guess if you drive a bus
yes.
in the era before people went on planes,
yeah.
then you went on a holiday on a coach and you were still on a bus.
Yes.
You spend all your life in a bus driving it and then you go on holiday and you're in a bus.
Got it. Yes.
Yeah.
Almost to Newcastle a little bit.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think that's absolutely valid. I don't know if there is actually going to be an answer to this next question. I call it the I haven't seen West Side Story question, in that I've never seen a professional production of West Side Story. I've seen the movies. Is there a musical out there that you regret not having seen? I mean, I guess maybe before you were born, or, is there something you go, oh, I wish I'd been there?
There are a couple of things that you'll be astonished that I haven't seen.
Yeah?
One of them is Phantom of the Opera. On some level, I regret not having seen everything I haven't seen because you learn. But there's some other, really, really big. I never saw Chorus Line when it first opened. I've seen about 29 West Side Stories because Arthur Lawrence was my godfather, so I had to see all of the productions that he directed, which I think is about 29.
Wow, that's a lot.
Subtle dig. I'm sorry, he's gone.
There you go. That could have been the musical you'd seen the most. You'd be dragged to it across the country. Yeah, I've never seen it. And I think, but even so, having watched, a couple of amateur productions of it when I was growing up, it's one of those shows that it stands up to people who aren't professional doing it just as much.
Yeah, I think that's true. And some shows don't. And some of them, even that don't stand up, are actually children-oriented shows that don't stand up. So in the case of Matilda, which I love, and I think Tim
Minchin. Yeah.
Very, very gifted and funny and essentially modest, purveyor of solid musical theater writing and very pretty tunes and a good sort of theatrical goat feet. Saw it in London, where it was completely marvelous. Saw it in New York, where it lacked only one important thing, which was intelligibility. I don't know what happened with accents or with the accent coach or whatever it was. But the further it was removed from its source, the composer, and was it Daltrey who did the...
Matthew Warchus directed it.
I know he directed, and he's wonderful, but
the
choreographer was...
Peter Darling.
Yeah, yes. And that was all those elbows and establishing that wonderful vocabulary. And to whatever extent that is officially part of the musical as it is sailed out into the world to everyone's benefit, I don't know. But I've seen some productions of that because I love the score. They don't really hold together. They don't really work. And it has to do with sometimes that it doesn't remember some of the intrinsic sort of sinew. What is holding this together in terms of tone? The minute that Den Mother, that battle axe, who's usually played by a man, becomes purely a joke, that role is no longer funny or menacing. It's just a sort of comedic brass ring. That's part of the sinew that I mean. It has to be connected to the storytelling through her point of view. You can't disassemble that stuff. And West Side is sort of impervious to that. It's almost impossible. The score keeps it together. The nature of the plot itself, which was vaguely reminiscent, obviously, and the great book, Arthur's great book. It's hard to pull that one apart.
Yeah. And I think potentially the same for the same guy with Gypsy, I think.
Yeah.
You can get into the, like you say, the sinew of that just from it being so clear on the page and in the music, I'm going to just take a quick drink. Sorry.
Was that like a bubbly lemon drink? What was that? Looked good.
This is something called lemon squash, which will confuse most American listeners. So I guess this is kind of our British version of Kool-Aid. So it's like you have a concentrate and then you add water.
Oh, you're a cook.
Really not. I wish I was. It's the bane of my husband's life. So when I came out, I spent a year in the States doing Mary Poppins. I had a search on to try and find some squash because I'm not great at drinking water. So this is how I drink my water, with a little bit of squash in it. You can have orange squash, have blackcurrant squash.
Wow.
But next time you come over, I'll bring you some squash.
Okay, great.
Hey, you know what? Seeing as I'm just drinking a little bit of squash, I'm going to say, why don't we have a little break and come back in a couple of minutes?
I love it.
Another podcast on the Bloop Network is Around the World in 80 Plays with West End theatre stars Lizzie B and Alfie Parker. We join them on the road as they tour the country with Dolly the dog, performing in shows and exploring the local arts and culture, and of course the theatres on the way. And here is a sneak peek.
And this week we're in Edinburgh, Scotland. Every theatre really has ghosts, but we're in Edinburgh. Edinburgh's known for its spooky ghosts. So why don't you?
Yeah, I've done my research, and I might have had an experience of my own.
Oh.
Right, so I am a true believer. Alfie is definitely more sceptical, but I believe in ghosts wholeheartedly. Like, I love watching paranormal programs. We watch a lot of celebrity ghost hunters. I just love it. I just kind of think, like, what's the point in not believing?
Yeah, my issue, right? I want to believe that there is something there. I think ghosts is a nice idea.
As long as they're nice ghosts.
Yeah, as long as they're not throwing things around. You know, like, no, because they grab me legs and go, bleh, all of that.
That's never happened to you, has
I know,
it?
but you hear stories of them being like, get out of my house, and they're rattling everything and all of that stuff, and it's just a bit...
Oh, please. Right, so anyway, theatre ghosts is like a massive thing. So I'd say probably every theatre in the world has a ghost.
Yeah.
But with Edinburgh being such a historical place, the Festival Theatre actually has 3 ghosts. And I had an experience with one of them, which I'll talk about later.
We had a brief experience.
Don't spoil it, okay?
Yeah, sorry.
Right, I'm going to talk to you about these ghosts. So the first one, the most famous ghost at the Edinburgh Festival Theatre is called the Great Lafayette. Lafayette? Hamilton reference for you. That's not who it is, but he's called the Great Lafayette. One of the most celebrated illusionists of the early 20th century. Do you know what an illusionist is, Alfie?
Yes, you know, kind of like disappearing in smoke and, you know, swords. And it's like,
Yeah.
It's like a branch of magician, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So kind of like Houdini.
Yeah,
Yes.
I wanted to say Houdini,
Okay.
but yeah.
Yeah. Cool. He was the highest paid entertainer in theatre at the time.
When was this?
In the early 20th century. Do you
Okay.
know when that was?
Do I know when that was?
Yeah, what year are we sort of talking there? Early 20th century?
1920 something?
Earlier.
Earlier,
But,
okay.
yeah.
The 1900s.
Yeah, brilliant.
Right.
Well done. This is going quite well.
I've got my GCSEs.
And apparently he was a very lavish performer. And so that brought the audiences in, which kind of justify that he was getting paid all this money.
Right.
So, spring of 1911, he was performing at the Edinburgh Festival Theatre, and he did his finale, which was called The Lion's Bride. And what he did in The Lion's Bride is he would swap places with a lion live on stage.
I mean, you are asking for trouble, though.
No. See, this is the thing. It's not that went wrong.
Oh, right, okay.
So this Lion's Bride thing happened successfully, and then out of nowhere...
Welcome back to Talk Musicals to Me. I'm here with Adam Guettel, and we are going to crack on with the next few questions, Adam, if that's okay.
Wonderful.
Which musical do you think should be compulsory in schools for kids to take part in, and in whatever capacity, not necessarily on stage?
I would avoid anything compulsory when it comes to the art form that you and I love, because that's a sure way to at least postpone a person's loving it, you know.
That's true. That's true.
I think the thing that I would want young people to take away from participating in a musical when they're young or having seen one is when a musical is good, it's a good musical to begin with. And then when it's lifted up onto the stage, well, it can give you a feeling you don't get from anything else. It's something to do with the sort of deeply sort of profound molecular sort of changes that happen. There's something gets pushed around inside of us and reconfigured with a great score and a great book, you know, and decent direction that takes us through a story in that way where we can ensconce ourselves completely and take the proscenium and sort of pull it around our heads and live in the story. To me, that's what we want them to take away with them, that such a thing is possible. Of course, it's also possible with movies in a slightly different way. But to cite a specific show, I mean, I would want the score to be a really exciting score for whatever young person. And if it's Hamilton, that's great, you know. Also, you know, and my shows generally don't always fall into this because sometimes they're a bit too sort of involved in terms of the vocal lines and stuff. But, you know, I want people to, especially young people, have silver in their pocket when they leave a theater or they leave the experience. They have melodies jangling around, lines that have always struck them very personally that they've kept with them, you know, like in a locket, you know.
This will lead on to this next question, actually. My husband actually remembers you talking about silver in your pocket. He went, I wonder if he'll say that, because it was such a great thing to say. And it's actually really useful for the next question, because is there a musical that you feel you walked out of with the most silver in your pocket, feeling changed or altered? Or did you feel like you'd live your life in a slightly different way after seeing it, you know?
Oh, well, certainly Sweeney Todd. And I was 14. So I was already like nearly analyzing stuff. And the silver I had was not just that momentous and unforgettable score, but also the milieu, the vocabulary physically that Hal came up with his wonderful designer, but also just the way that the form was used, using music to really delineate character and push the story forward. So that would be a huge one. But well before that, Turn of the Screw by Britten, really moved by. I was in that. And it's hard for me to choose, what's the most silver in the pocket, but I have so much from Fiddler and so much from West Side and shows that are less known. I just we just carried around. We have our sort of unnamed kind of tacit Rolodex, in our minds and in our hearts, and also the ache in our heart and in our throat to do well in the form, to use it at that level, to get to that level with it. And that's also a kind of, it's an energy cell,
Yeah. You talk about Fiddler there. I think that the opening number of that show is utterly brilliant. And the way it introduces character, culture, religion, tradition.
Absolutely, 100%. And even before the opening number, I think it's Joe Stein. Is that who?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
But anyway, the very first monologue, which begins the show before the number.
Yes.
It's one of the best things ever written in the theater because it perfectly lifts the story up for us to participate in. It's a fabulous sort of spiritual roadmap as well as narrative.
I love that. So the silver in your pocket coming out, especially with ticket prices these days. If you come out with something that you've learned along the way, some kind of bonus.
You better come out with something.
Exactly. You don't have to name names here at all, but if your relationship with musical theatre was a love affair, when have you come closest to calling it quits? And, has it been because you've seen something bad, or is there a musical you don't have to mention, but that you came out and go, I'm not going to ever write again?
I've never gotten to that point. Certainly before I did musicals, I'd done a lot of incidental scores and a lot of documentary scores, but I drew the line there because of my family background in some ways. Obviously, predictably, it was sort of writing for musicals was the last thing I wanted to do. So I broke up with it first. And then I got back together with it when I started writing because it was so hard. And so it felt to me once I did one, I felt that it was a wonderful way to spend maybe my life because you can't get good at it. You can just keep getting better with any luck. And Floyd, I've said this a lot, but Floyd was an interesting test case for me because it was really the first, and I'd done operas and I'd, various things before that in the theater, but it was a test case because you can't get through the process of writing a musical because of all the different moving parts and all the personalities and egos and things and financial issues. It takes forever. You better wake up every day with those bells have to be jangling. Like, I'm still interested. I'm still wanting to finish this. And you ask yourself, well, why? And every show, why is this so personal? Why are those bells still ringing? And again, I've said this before and I don't want to bore anyone, but if they happen to have heard me say it, but I realized that Floyd Collins, which we're doing this spring at Lincoln Center for the first time in 30 years in New York, was about a person with a noble aspiration, and he fails in pursuit of that dream. But if the dream itself is noble, is worthwhile, has intrinsic value, is there nobility in not getting it? I think our show rests upon partly that's true, but my life would have had to and does have to also, because when I was writing Floyd, I kind of realized, am I actually going to try to carve out a life in the musical theater when my grandfather's Richard Rodgers? Is that the dumbest thing? And of course, the answer is yes, it's very dumb. And, I'm unlikely to get to his status and all that. And is that okay? I had to come to terms with not being as famous and not being as good or, and all the things that when the ego is in its sort of first ambitious, ravenous state, you're like, I've got to surpass, I have to blah, blah, blah. But But then we realize in our work, yours as well, very much so, that the process is so delicious and so edifying and such a teacher that the process really is where it's at. The results they vary. People say, but you go to Vermont for 3 weeks alone. You don't see anyone. You just write. And I'm like, well, yeah. Why would you do that with your life? And I say, well, I'm practicing. And they go, well, what are you practicing for? And I'm like, death.
Oh, God.
Because I'm learning about myself.
Yeah.
And through characters that I'm writing, I'm learning about myself and, kind of getting ready. When I die, I hope all this work that I've done in the theater, when I die, before my last breath, I can be like,
Wow, honestly, you are held in a huge amount of high esteem in the industry, and definitely thumbs up from most of the people I know who talk about musical theatre. You get a huge thumbs up. I mean, you won't see this on the podcast, but Adam just said, "Will I get a big?"
That's great to hear. What if I died? What if I died right now?
Please don't.
On the interview, I was like, "That's great news."
And you're done. You're done. Nice to meet you. It was lovely knowing you, Adam. This isn't really about other musicals. It can be about yours, obviously about yours. It's indefinable, I know, but how would you come closest to defining the secret of a good musical?
I think good musicals have certain shared qualities. They set up a vocabulary, they set up a lexicon, they set up a kind of codex for the world that the story is going to take place in, that in terms of tone, in terms of the level of language, the kind of language, time and place. This world is set up and it's a compact with the audience. And if you don't break that compact, you have a chance of having their trust throughout the storytelling. That's very important to begin with, in my view. If you break the world, you break the rules, it becomes just a kind of vaudevillian exercise in good jokes and high notes. Mm-hmm. So that would be kind of the sort of a starting point. I think a show that has a central metaphor that music serves particularly well, as opposed to other things, if it needs music to be told, I think that's very good for a show. Certainly there are exceptions to the rule and successful ones and memorable ones, but I'm fairly conventional. Those things I do try to observe in my own work, in addition to wanting a musical to be a fresh palette and a retooled factory for me as a writer, under the basic principle that we do our best work at the edge of our own competence. We need to not know how to do it when we start. We need to not be sure. And I think also it's important for the book writer, the director, and the composer, but first the book writer and the composer, lyricist, before a director comes in, because the order of things is important too. They have to really have those ambitions. I mean, one of the fun things about Floyd Collins, we were quite young. I think I started writing it at 26. It first got on in Philadelphia when I was 29 and then in New York when I was 31. But Tina and I just didn't give a crap about the basic, I want songs and this. And, of course, once we had really gone through the process of seeing the show in front of audiences and changed it as a result, those edicts, those kind of basic traditional, we call them traditional, but they're almost physical properties to storytelling with music, they came back in anyway. So with Floyd Collins, the first version we did was sort of like a musicalized documentary of every single thing that happened, every character. And we saw it. People were bored to death. So were we. It was just an exercise. And we completely combined characters. We were loyal to the spirit of the story, but we stopped being accurate about the letter of the actual story. And we began to learn how to shape it into a musical. But we had no fear about what kind of, so he's underground, he's in a cave, he's echoing against himself, all these things that sort of revealed themselves. They weren't done on purpose, but we had a strong sense of like, fuck, every young person, fuck all that shit, man. And we're going to do something new and it's going to be brilliant. And of course, it usually isn't. It wasn't for us.
Yeah.
But I guess I would start with those things if I even am sort of answering your question. I can't remember.
You absolutely are. I am. I'm just agog listening to you. It's wonderful to hear. I guess where I stand when it comes to seeing a good musical is the musical has to know what it is and stay true to that. And I think that authenticity is key. And I think you've just said that in a far better way.
It's this again, because if you break that compact with the audience, they start to feel a little used. And then they sit there and go, okay, where's the next, fancy ululating melisma from, the incredible riffer of the week? Also just in the margins, you cannot throw a pebble without hitting someone on any street in America who can't riff like Stevie Wonder in 1973. And musicals have become too often a sort of canvas for that sort of thing. And I'm just like, it's not very expressive of specific character. It's expressive of Stevie Wonder.
Yeah.
I mean, I adore Stevie Wonder. He's a pillar of my music making. And I use him as a rough example for a kind of show-offy singing, which is akin to, in the Baroque tradition, all of the set melismas that people would do. And it had a lot to do with your reputation as a singer then, if you could pull those things up. Were they helpful in delineating one character from the next? I don't imagine that they were. And they're not today either.
Yeah. Quite often when I'm teaching, I'm like, it's great that you can do that.
Yeah.
Quite often people will put a riff in something that should never have a riff in, something from Oklahoma or, really anachronistic. I'm like, it's great that you can do that. If it doesn't suit the song, if the song isn't written in that place, don't do it. And if you are going to do it in a song that it could possibly fit in, make sure you're doing it for a reason and it's a character choice, not just because you're going, look how I can sing, because like you say, it brings the audience out and suddenly the authenticity is gone.
Yeah, it denudes character and it's we all have egos minus the size of Montana. It's always something one always, and I, as a composer, I will confess, sometimes I get a little all up in my, well, I can write it. They ought to hear it if I can, but is it good for the storytelling? And I think that's always something for me to watch as a composer. It's not just these fabulous, talented singers who have those capabilities. And I think you may have gotten a cue to move along from your producer. So let's keep moving. I know what that means.
One final question, and this is the rule breaker question, even though we've spoken about your work alongside all these other great musicals. When you're having a down day or when things are feeling like bleak and desperate, is there a musical you go to that heals you?
Well, first of all, I whistle a happy tune. I mean, that goes without saying, but
That, of course you do. The family tradition. Is there a musical that you go to cheer yourself up? To go, I need to feel good. I'm going to put on a show and listen to it or go and see it.
No, I don't do that with musicals. I feel wonderful when I listen to them if I'm in the right mood. But if I'm in a really rough place, I need to, do boring things like get on the elliptical or talk to my absolutely wonderful partner, Lindsay, or have my dog on my lap or go for a walk, normal, boring things. I don't turn to shows to cheer me up. Sometimes, though, I do turn to my trust fund for my grandfather's work to cheer me up. I go, well,
there you go. That'll help.
At least I've lived very comfortably without making any hits. I mean, I've consistently worked and people think maybe I'm just eating bonbons, and I work all the time and have written consistently, even though for many years I didn't have anything new on Broadway. And work itself is a huge way, writing and applying myself and buckling down and doing it. Much anxiety and depression for me just comes from the resistance to confronting the challenge of something that, as I already said, I've decided to do that I don't know how to do. And the more I resist it and put it off, the worse I feel and the more depressed I feel. So just getting to work and writing my own stuff is a good way to combat depression.
Well, I'm going to end this by telling you personally that when I'm feeling low and blue and when my ears need to relax and chill out, I put on The Light in the Piazza.
All right.
Those opening chords, that overture, it just helps me breathe again. And I want to thank you for that.
When you're drinking, do you listen to Days of Wine and Roses? I would suggest, I could recommend that would be maybe helpful to help you drink.
Maybe I should. I'll try that later on and I'll let you know how I get on.
You're the greatest. This is so much fun.
Thank you so much for talking musicals to me, Adam. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I'm glad you seem to have enjoyed yourself.
I sure did. You're great at this, Caroline. I just want to say that. You're terrific.
Oh, thank you so much. This is such early days for me, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're doing great. The energy is terrific. It's very accessible. One doesn't feel on the spot or anything like that. I like this kind of thing anyway, but it's very fresh what you're doing, and you and Aaron, and so good luck with it. You're the best.
Thank you so much, and good luck with Floyd Collins. I'm hoping maybe we can get out to New York and see it, because I would love to see that done.
Well, if you do, you must let me know, and
I'll let you know. Thanks, Adam.
All right, good.
Take care and good luck with it all.
You too.
Lots of love. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening today. This has been Talk Musicals to Me for the Bloop Network. My fabulous producer is Aaron Ware, and the music you heard is from the pen of the sublime Tom Self. If you get a moment, please subscribe or follow and rate the podcast by clicking the stars below on the podcast page. It takes about 2 seconds to do, and it will really help the podcast and its future life and would make us massively, eternally, enormously grateful. In the meantime, another huge thanks for tuning in, and please do so again next time to see who will be next up to talk musicals to me.